Hey everyone, I'm Steve from GamersNexus.net, and this is our Just Cause 3 video card benchmark. So obviously looking at all the different GPUs that we have, AMD, NVIDIA alike, and testing them on the new Square Enix published game, Just Cause 3, which is a continuation of a somewhat long-standing series at this point. It's basically an open world, destroy things game, and that makes it interesting to benchmark. It's a unique challenge, and there's some cool graphics tech in the game. There's some technology for the global illuminations, for water, and for things like that that enable the very long view distances. This is part of being an open world, is that you can see very far, obviously. So there's some level of detail scaling that's fairly intensive compared to what you might find in other games of the open world nature. Skyrim, as an old example, has always been very reserved in its presentation of detail. And if you look at the LOD, the level of detail, and the view distances, that's sort of where they're able to preserve performance. They don't actually draw that many objects very far. With Just Cause 3, a lot of stuff still gets drawn pretty far out. Things like active objects, actors, which would be characters, cars, other vehicles, things like that don't get drawn too far away. But with the terrain, you can see pretty far. With the landscape in general, the water, you can see that. It's not as high quality as if you were up close, but the general idea here is that there's a lot of detail and it goes pretty far away in terms of view distance. So some of the more interesting items in terms of graphics settings, you can find the full list in the article, by the way, linked in the description below if you want to learn more about the graphics settings in Just Cause 3. But off the top here, the most interesting ones would generally be water detail, first and foremost, because that is a GameWorks enabled technology within Just Cause 3. So that would be part of the NVIDIA GameWorks suite, which, as all of you know, is sometimes controversial, but at the end of the day, it's in there. So we got to talk about it. That is called WaveWorks. The specific implementation of the GameWorks toolkit that is in there is WaveWorks. And that helps enable things like crests and wakes behind ships and players, and all kinds of splash effects and things like that. So that is in there. And then there's also water tessellation. Tessellation we've talked about a few times now. There's a good video on the channel already where we talked to someone from Epic Games about tessellation, what it is, what it means for gaming. But to recap quickly, tessellation is effectively multiplication of triangles. So in a game world, most things are, all things actually, are comprised of some sort of triangle or quad or some very basic rudimentary geometry. This table, as an example, this table is a rectangle in real life. In a game, it might be drawn as two triangles, kind of divided down the middle. With tessellation, what you do is you take the triangles that are already being used to create an object, the composition of an object, and you multiply them. And that multiplication creates greater apparent depth, and I use the word apparent very specifically. It looks like there's more detail. You can see more bumps and roughness and grit in the surface, for example, and that is done through tessellation. So water tessellation's in here specifically for water. It basically makes it look more like a natural fluid rather than kind of a weird glue-like substance that you might find in some games. The next thing is LOD factor. So LOD is level of detail. Talked about it a bit already, and that just scales how much detail is in different types of graphics elements within the game as you distance yourself from them. So for example, meshes. A mesh is a really easy example. Meshes, it's just like real life meshes where you have sort of almost a wireframe underlying the whatever the model is. So think of a clay model, right? You have a wireframe of a car, and on top of that you put your clay. So there's your mesh and your modeling going on. With the LOD factor, scaling it down will reduce the complexity and the appearance of detail or depth of different objects in the game to include their host meshes. And it also scales down things like textures. So textures will pop in a bit slower depending on your LOD scaling, and they will also have the lower resolutions rendered for a longer period as you approach them with lower LOD scaling. So that's the other one. And then global illumination is pretty important. This is the item that deals with reflections and interacting with bounces of light. So when you have a light source in a game, you have the light source, it casts a ray of light, and it hits an object and it illuminates that object. With global illumination, you're saying, I'm going to take this ray of light that's hitting a car, and now we're going to look at the car. We're going to say, okay, this is a metallic surface. This has some reflectivity to it. and we're going to bounce that light off of the metallic surface appropriate to the reflectivity or whatever index the game developers are using to determine how reflective that object is. And then you trace the light through its bounces until it stops bouncing, until it effectively runs out of energy, we'll call it. So that's global illumination. Lowering that or turning it off in this instance will just eliminate the multi-bounce lighting, we'll call it. And so that makes your lighting a bit more simplistic, but it saves you on performance. Methodology is defined in the article if you want to learn about how we tested this. There are some pretty specific things going on. And the main thing is we have very high and high settings that were tested. When we say high, what we mean is we changed all the options to say the word high, and then we also disabled SSAO, global illumination, motion blur, and screen space reflections to create our version of high settings because there are no presets. For very high, we turned it all on and set it to very high, and for AA, we always used FXAA for the anti-aliasing. Our benchmark course is already separately on the channel at Max Graphics, but you can see it again in this video, if not right now. And that course shows the obligatory completion of missions that were at the very beginning of the game. So we've already completed those first few missions that you have to complete, and we're now released freely into the open world, and that is when we started the benchmark search. So I looked at a few different things here, and the main items that I looked at included combat and destruction, included grass, hills, foliage, and dense geometry, and we also looked at cities, which would be included in that dense geometry. Things like action elements, cars, combat, again, with different levels of movement or different items used to fight, like grenades and explosives. So looked at all of that stuff and ultimately determined that when running on this one line segment up a grass hill, we had the most intensive experience with the game out of all the other stuff. So the cities weren't nearly as intensive, at least the ones that I was able to test. And the combat, although it was intensive, it seemed to be a general theme that anything which was highly explosive, like all of the fuel tanks and silos and things like that, they all tended to be in areas of low geometric or object complexity. So you actually had a higher average FPS, and then when you blew that stuff up, it ate into that and ultimately produced a low FPS during the explosions that was similar and comparable to what we see in our grassland fields benchmark. So we went with that because you want to reduce any chance of test variance. You want to be 100% reproducible and reliable in your results. And so we want to eliminate any type of dynamic element within the game where possible. That's where we came up with our worst case scenario. So again, this is a worst case scenario. You will generally have higher FPS when you're grappling around or traveling through cities or what have you. But at the worst times, the charts you'll see here are what you can expect for gameplay. And it's fairly complex in terms of the search that we set forth, and you can learn more about that in all of our other GPU test methodology pieces where we talk about how we test games. Let's get started with 4K. Unlike competitive shooters, Just Cause 3 doesn't demand for a constantly high FPS. We found that the game is fairly playable at 50 FPS average, and there's some negative impact to fluidity once you drop below 50 FPS. But generally it's playable at about that range. Obviously, more is better for the most part with some limitations, but you won't need the exact 60 that we normally demand for some shooters. The GTX 980 Ti runs Just Cause 3 at just under 50 FPS average when at 4K and high. That's all high settings with the disabled FX options that we already mentioned. The 1% and 0.1% lows are pretty bad, really, and they both run under 30 FPS, so that makes for some unpleasant, spiky periods of gameplay, but this is a worst-case benchmark design, so generally, if you tweak a few settings down on the 980 Ti, it will be a fairly fluid playing experience until the worst-case scenarios, at which point it will still be playable, it'll just hit some laggy times. There is effectively zero SLI scaling revealed in our testing, and we talked to NVIDIA about this. It is a known issue. They're working on it. They're implementing new updates to the drivers and so forth to improve SLI scaling. A single GTX 980 Ti right now is about as good as two of them, at least in this case, and you'll see that trend continues more or less through the other charts. The GTX 980 runs at 40.5 FPS average at 4K, and the 390X hits 42 FPS average, a bit higher. Neither of these cards, though, produces a frame rate we'd really find comfortable for play, and the settings or resolution would have to be tweaked to make them better for playability. The GTX 980 Ti at 1440p, however, runs Just Cause 3 at about 65 FPS average, so that's 1440p and very high, with the lows at about half of that. The GTX 980 is 16.7% behind the 980 Ti and is playable at 55 FPS in our worst case scenario. The 390X also hits 55 FPS, making it playable, though it does so with lower 1% and 0.1% frame rates. So that'd be 22.5 versus 30 and 20.5 versus 28. Pretty big difference there, and generally not pleasant, but it's still within playable range, and you can make some tweaks to improve that. Looking further down the list, we see the R9 290X is still playable at its 51 FPS average output, with the GTX 970 trailing just behind. And again, I'd recommend some settings tweaks to both of these cards to maybe drop high to medium or something like that to keep a more consistent 50 plus FPS. And I left crossfire tests in this particular chart because it demonstrates a lack of crossfire scaling at this time. A future driver will likely resolve this, but right now there's zero crossfire scaling, and SLI scaling is very small. It's a couple percent at very best. So multi-GPU configurations are not too happy with this game right now. Looking to 1080p at very high, this is probably the key setting where most users will be targeting. With this configuration, anything including and north of the R9 380, effectively equivalent to the R9 285 in the above chart, because we don't have a 380 anymore, it was on loan, or the GTX 964 GB at $210 would be sufficient for Just Cause 3, but you'd probably want to make a few settings tweak to the lower end cards, like the 380, 285, and 960s for better sustained frame rates during intensive periods. The 964 GB and 962 GB show a small disparity, 2 FPS or 4.3%, but nothing nearly as interesting as what we saw in AC Syndicate, and you can check that content if you're curious about the 2 versus 4 GB disparity. Take a look at the R9 390X in this chart. So again, we're looking at the 1080 and very high chart. 390X versus the GTX 970. At very high, the 390X leads the 970 by a couple percent. So you're at 75 versus 71 FPS. The 390X also sustains higher 1% low FPS. So commit that to memory for a moment, and we'll come back to it in a couple of minutes here or less. Moving down to high and disabling some of the FX like SSAO, global illumination, screen space, reflections, and so forth, FPS improves considerably on most GPUs, and this is particularly visible at the low end, where the somewhat aged and decrepit R9 270X, once a powerhouse for the budget class, now enters a range of relative playability despite poor 1% and 0.1% low frame times. The GTX 950 is outperformed by the R9 285 and thus the R9 380, marginally, with the R9 380X taking a more reasonable lead of 5.9% over the GTX 960 cards. Now, here's the part that we're bringing back from memory. The GTX 970 is at 102 FPS average, which leads the R9 390X in this benchmark. Something we've seen recently in other titles, especially those that make use of tessellation heavily, like Fallout and Assassin's Creed, is that the 970 does actually lead the 390X in a lot of games these days. The 390X, however, appears advantaged at the highest quality setting, which is the one we looked at a moment ago, but loses ground at lower quality settings. So here, the 970 is actually a bit ahead, and previously the 970 was a bit behind. A moment ago, for example, to recap everything, the 390X was in a lead of a couple percent, pretty small, and this delta between the 970 and 390X with the 970 in the lead is 11.2% at the same resolution, just some settings tweaked. We haven't yet found the cause of this, but I did substantial research with the site's Mike Gaglione, and we spent a few extra hours of validation trying to figure out what it was. I haven't found it yet, but the narrowed down list of settings is SSAO, global illumination, and texture quality, and that's what we're researching next. So we'll let you guys know if we figure out what's going on with this disparity, and it requires further research. So what are the best cards for Just Cause 3? Looking at things from the 1080 range first, the 1080 settings with very high play best on a 970 or 390X, not too surprising, that's fairly common for these games. The 970 is a bit better value in this case in terms of frames per dollar. It's cheaper these days. And the 390X, if you want AMD or you're pushing towards another game where it's advantaged, it's not a bad buy. It's just not the best value comparatively. At 1080 with high, the options I'd look at would be the R9 380X, sort of at the top end of that. It's 6% faster than the GTX 960 on average, or the R9 380, which is comparable to the 285 in these charts, or the GTX 960 4GB card if you're planning on playing games that are more VRAM intensive, like AC Syndicate, although that game struggles on the 960 to begin with. So those would be my three main options for 1080 and high. And then at 1440, you're basically looking at a 980 Ti or a 980, both of which are very solid performing cards and consistent with 1440 performance, but neither of which will play 4K very well at this particular point in time with Just Cause 3. So until there's some sort of SLI optimization or other optimization, 4K is not super playable on Just Cause 3 right now. You can make it work with some settings drops, but no one really wants to do that because then you're just blowing up lower settings at a much higher resolution. Although it's not terrible depending on the game, but this game I don't like it. So that's where I would go for different cards, different settings, and things like that. Post in the comments below if you have any questions, and check out the full article linked in the description below for more information on Just Cause 3 and the settings and all of that. And as always, hit that Patreon link in the post-roll video. Thank you for watching. I will see you all next time.